What's up again, everybody? I have spent the better part of today messing around with none other than my spoiler card himself, Riptide. And I've been playing around in Blitz with Riptide, which perhaps might not be the best idea, but I think it's a really good way to get your feet wet with regards to what Riptide does. And I wanted to put out a list for you as sort of like a, this is what I recommend trying baseline list. This is what I've been messing around with basically all day. I've taken a lot of L's and I've learned a lot. And in doing so, I've learned kind of what I like, what feels good, and I want to share that with you. If you enjoy this video, if you like the content for the Flesh and Blood, for the new set, Outsiders, make a number, climb slightly higher, and let's talk about Riptide. So Riptide, if you don't know, is a brand new hero in the game. He is a ranger, he is a young hero, and he is a 19 health 4 intellect dude fisherman who says whenever you play a card from hand, you can put a card from your hand face down into your arsenal, which is super cool. It avoids having to pay for reloading. And then whenever a trap you control triggers, deal 1 damage to the attacking hero. And with this list, we're going to try a little bit of both. I think it's fun to really kind of understand what the hero wants to do or likes to do by just dabbling in all of it. It may not be the most optimal, but that's what we are doing, and that's what this list is doing for you. We are running Barbed Castaway, namely because it allows us to use this turn the arrow face up and put an aim counter on it. We don't have a ton of arrows, but the ones that we do have get better with aim counters, and I like that, so that's what we're doing. Currently running Blossom of Spring because this deck is very low to the ground. It's very redline. I call this an aggro deck, but it does have some mid-range qualities. It's kind of hard to say aggro deck for Riptide because he does play traps and he does play a couple of like other defense reaction-y kind of things. Nevertheless, we are really low to the ground, and I'll talk about the philosophy behind the deck after we break down this equipment, but this just gives us a resource. Crown of Providence because I don't have anything better to put in right now. Maybe you could consider New Horizon. I like this Quiver right now, namely because we can just pitch into it, and in some random scenario late game where we actually go to the late game and Blitz, then we'd be able to like get arrows back. But right now you just pitch into it early and fix your hand on like turn 0. Snapdragon Scalers is a super must. Gives go again to basically every attack in this deck. And Toxic Tips, really fun little card. Pay 1, create a status effect if it hits, and that's really cool. So let's talk about the philosophy of the deck. It is low to the ground. It's all about attacking across multiple times and trying to take advantage of, like the fact that a lot of our cards are some of our cards are overstated for their cost and for their aim counter usage. First of all, things like Ravenous Rabble are how you start your turn. If you play a Ravenous Rabble from your hand, you can then load an arrow into your arsenal. So it allows you to skip the step of like paying to load an arrow, and also allows you to put that arrow face down so that you can turn it face up and give it an aim counter for basically a resource, which is really good when you have 0 cost arrows like a mobilizing shot. This basically becomes a 1 cost arrow with this pretty solid on hit effect that we can kind of manipulate and do things with. So we have Ravenous Rabble to start our turns. We also have Scar for a Scar, which is active immediately because don't forget, we start at 19 health. So Scar for a Scar is active immediately, which means we can also start our turns this way. Riptide is one of those cool heroes that you have to consider your turn carefully, and in doing so, you can get a lot of benefit out of your turn. And how you start your turn kind of shows how you'll end your turn as well. It feels a lot like some of the other heroes that are very specific on when and how you start your turn. So we want turn starters. It's kind of like a ninja, how they have like a chain starter. We want turn starters, and Ravenous Rabble allows us to load our arsenal. Scar for a Scar allows us to load our arsenal. Weirdly enough, Sigil of Solace also allows us to load our arsenal. Even something weird like Oasis Respite can load our arsenal on our own turn. Nevertheless, it all kind of adds up to, nice little turn starters. Overall, big attacks that we're looking to push after loading our arsenal with something that we want to fire out there. Things like Death Touch. We have the yellows and the reds here in Death Touch. It's a solid little card that has the huge drawback of being a 1 for 6 that can't be played from your hand. You have to play it from your arsenal. Nevertheless, if we are able to load this up after playing something like Ravenous Rabble or even like a Premeditate, then this card gets real strong real quick, and we want these cards to hit because we want to create Bloodrot Pox tokens. Technically, Inertia and Frailty are also options, but Bloodrot Pox is kind of our go-to thing. We want to push damage, we want to threaten an on-hit effect of creating Bloodrot Pox. And so we're pushing with like Death Touch, we're pushing with Infecting Shot, which also on hit creates a Bloodrot Pox token. And then we're also lacing our arrows with Bloodrot. I wish this card came in a cycle. I wish this card came in a cycle. Can I say that again? I wish this card came in a cycle. The fact that it doesn't is really sad. Other pumps that we have in this deck are 1 copy of Lace with Inertia. We have 2 Premeditates, which is just a great card for like everybody in the set. And so we just throw this down. We threaten a Ponder token creation, which is just a card draw. And then we give +3. As long as the thing comes from Arsenal, we give +3 to our next attack, which is fantastic. And playing this allows us to load our Arsenal. Barbed Undertow has been one of my favorite cards to play, and it's almost always like a full block from the opponent, which is great. 1 copy of Drill Shot, I recently cut it down to 2, or so from 2 to 1 as well. But these are like our biggest main arrows that we are firing. Some other interesting little pumps. We have Take Aim, which allows us to pump any ranger attack. So that actually pumps everything in the deck except for Rav and Scar, which is fantastic because it does actually pump Virulent Touch. Because as you can see, this is a hybrid attack, and it is a portion of it is a ranger attack. So we can actually play Take Aim and load Virulent Touch and then pump Virulent Touch, which is great. We can do the same thing with Take Aim and load Death Touch and throw Death Touch out there from 9. Again, we have these nice little on-hit create Bloodrot Pox tokens, and that's what we want to do to try and close the game out. We also want to take advantage of like codexes, Codex of Bloodrot. I put all 3 in here. I was running just 2 copies of Inertia, and then I ran, one time I just tried Frailty, and I was like, you know what? That was actually not too terribly bad for me. I know it gives the other person the option to do the same effect as well, but I liked being able to go and fetch the card that I needed for a card that I didn't care about from my hand. And I also included Codex of Bloodrot simply because we want to push more Bloodrot. And that is like one of our ways that we can win the game. If our opponent doesn't efficiently block us out correctly, then we just try to create these Codexes, or these Bloodrots, I should say, and just run with it from there. Outside of all of this, we have a couple of traps only. I'm running Tar Pit Trap ×2, Buzzsaw Trap, and Collapsing Trap. These are most likely to all trigger. Tar Pit Trap particularly is a fantastic little thing because it turns off on hit effects, and it almost always falls on things that will trigger the effect to deal 1 damage from just being a, throw it on a go again. Like you can throw it on anything that has go again, and then all of a sudden our Riptide is going to deal them 1 damage. And that's great because it's another way that we can just close out games. Buzzsaw Trap, same thing. This almost always has a target. Even if it doesn't, more often than not, I have found that this does. Even if this doesn't, it's just solid. It just blocks 3. I've almost never used it for pitching in this deck simply because we just don't need it. And then Collapsing Trap has a solid connection as well because it just falls on anything with go again, and then you can get some benefit out of it. So with this deck, you just have the capability of trying just about everything that Riptide can do. He can play a little bit more defensively with some of his defensive cards. He can load in interesting ways. He can buff things. He can push extra damage. He can play generics. He can play non-arrow attacks, and he can play arrow things. For example, and I just jumped into a random practice game with Talishar because I wanted to just show a couple of things that you can do. We drew into this hand. This is literally the start of the game. I have no clue what's on the top of the deck, but we can start with Codex of Inertia, and if we want to, we can just straight up let this resolve and give us something, which isn't terrible, but we could also just like load Death Touch here, which is kind of cool. If we didn't even want to do this and create the Ponder and kind of like tax our opponent, let's say this is like turn 0 and we don't really care because we know they're going to like draw up and the discard doesn't matter, we could actually just start with, like Premeditate. And in doing so, we can load Death Touch here. And from that point, we can just throw Death Touch. Pitching like the Codex, I think, is fine. Or if you wanted to, you could pitch Lace with Inertia and then Arsenal the Codex. Now, this is an 8, just threatening the Ponder token. also threatening creating one of those Bloodrot Poxes. And it's an uncomfortable like number to try and block out. And if this isn't the first turn of the game and your opponent is not incentivized to block, they have to weigh their options here of giving me an extra card draw, of also giving them basically 2 damage off of a Bloodrot Pox, or trying to block inefficiently in like 2 cards plus a 2 block equipment. I jumped into a secondary game and I advanced the hand to something kind of weird and funky and interesting. But this is also something that essentially you can just straight up do with this setup. Like I drew into a bunch of pumps, but all of the pumps can apply to Death Touch, which means you can go take aim and then load Death Touch face down. Then you can play take aim again. You can... if you wanted to, I guess you could play Premeditate, pop the Blossom of Spring. So all of those buffs currently affect Death Touch, which means when we play Death Touch, we could play Death Touch for 14. That is so stupid, but if you drew into all these pumps, that's the benefit of playing those types of pumps, is because Take Aim falls on the next Ranger attack action card, not Arrow. You get a benefit for running like Death Touch and Virulent Touch, like all of those cards you get benefits from. So you can essentially just create a very large attack with a lot of incentives for your opponent to try and mitigate some damage, because otherwise they're getting a Bloodrot Pox and you're getting a Ponder just off of like all of those cards. And even on a turn like this where you just threw your like non-attack into the arsenal, you can play that non-attack. You can then play Ravenous Rabble to trigger the reload effect of Riptide here. This comes for 4. That's pretty solid. And in doing so, you can, after this clears, of course, you can turn this up, gain an aim counter, if you wanted to. I mean, like, depending on your life total versus the opponent's. Obviously, I have less life than the computer because they started 1,000. But this Scar could be active. And you can also just chuck out the old... Come on, there we go. Chuck out the old Infecting Shot, which is buffed by that non-attack that we arsenaled. Just threw that arsenal in there. And then it's also buffed by the effect itself, which, by the way, if you didn't know, Infecting Shot gains +1. Let's click it. There it goes. It gains +1 if you have an aim counter on it, which is why we run the old aim counter generator bow. And then it also creates a Bloodrot Pox. So we're able to snake together like generic attacks and also an on-hit that is disruptive. And again, this is why I really enjoy this line. So check this out. If you enjoyed the video, make numbers climb higher, do the old subscribe thing. Tell me down in a comment below what deck you want to see next. And as always, thanks for watching.